All right, great. Thank you so much, Dixie, and thank you for the invitation. I really appreciate it. Um, I'm sorry though that I couldn't come to Alaska in person. Although I admit I would have preferred to come in the summer rather than any time where there's snow on the ground. That's for sure. Um, I've only had the great fortune to come to Alaska once. I was in Fairbanks in the summer of 2019, so it was summer in August of 2019. We actually came to Alaska to hold a NAGPRA review committee meeting in Fairbanks, and it was my first visit to Alaska, and I really enjoyed it. It was a great opportunity to have the review committee meet there, but also to hear about what was happening in Alaska, and in particular, what's happening with NAGPRA in Alaska. So I'm here today to give you a little bit of an overview about NAGPRA in particular, some basics. I'm going to start with some real basics. As this is an emerging professionals group, I want to be sure that I'm giving those of you who may not have a lot of background knowledge, some places to start and some places to gain more knowledge. And then give you some updates, sort of where things are right now with NAGPRA. So to start off, let me tell you a little bit about who I am and why I'm here talking to you. So as Dixie said, my name is Melanie O'Brien, and I'm the manager of the National Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act program, or as it's abbreviated, NAGPRA. A lot of letters smushed together there. And the National NAGPRA program is housed within the National Park Service, but we have national responsibilities. We don't actually do NAGPRA for the National Park Service. We're just administratively housed here. I carry out responsibilities for administrating NAGPRA, the law itself, on behalf of the Secretary of the Interior. So if you were to pick up a copy of the Act, which I highly encourage anybody who hasn't read it, you may not be able to see that very well, to get a copy of the law itself and read it. It's pretty short, not too difficult to read. You'll see in there that Congress said quite often that the Secretary of the Interior has to do certain things. Well, believe it or not, the Secretary of the Interior does not do all those things. The Secretary of the Interior has delegated a lot of those responsibilities, and many of them fall to me. So that is my job, to carry out the responsibilities that are delegated to the Secretary in the law itself. And I'll tell you a little bit more about what some of those responsibilities are, but one of them is to provide assistance to museums, Indian tribes, Alaska Native villages, Native Hawaiian organizations, and really anyone who needs assistance with carrying out the responsibilities under NAGPRA. So being here today is one of my responsibilities, and so I'm glad that you've given me the opportunity to fulfill that responsibility. I'm going to share my screen with you because it's another way that we try to fulfill these responsibilities that we have through providing a lot of information on our website. Hopefully you can all see that. This is our main web page. It's nps.gov/NAGPRA. It is full of information about the law itself and about what the responsibilities are. And that includes accessing a copy of the law itself. So if you haven't had an opportunity to read it, it's a good place to get that, to take a look at it. And you can see that we have a lot of different areas of the law that are covered by our website, but are under our responsibility. This getting started part of our website is a great place if you're not familiar with NAGPRA to get some basic information about the law and the process. Then we're responsible for assisting with compliance, and that's compliance by museums as well as federal agencies for the repatriation portions of the Act. We also are responsible for some of the enforcement pieces of NAGPRA. As I mentioned, we manage a review committee. That's a federal advisory committee that advises the Secretary of the Interior on issues related to repatriation. And there's information about that review committee here. Incidentally, this photo was taken at that Alaska meeting. I think this is from the stage in the auditorium at the Museum of the North in Fairbanks. We also award grants every year, federal grants, to assist museums and Indian tribes and Alaska Native villages and Native Hawaiian organizations with repatriation under NAGPRA. Our website includes copies of the law as well as the regulations and other policy. We have quite an extensive reference library here. And then we've got some additional information about our staff, events, and some news links. Limited news links related to our work primarily. There's a lot more news you can find on NAGPRA that's not here. So that's just a little bit of an overview of sort of the information that we provide, at least on our website, and a lot of information that you can find here, especially about the law itself, the history of the law and how it came to be the law. For those of you who aren't aware, NAGPRA was passed in 1990. So we are now at, well, tomorrow it will be 33 years since NAGPRA was signed into law. NAGPRA was signed on November 16th, 1990. So a lot has happened in 33 years of repatriation as the law of the United States, but there's still quite a bit that needs to be done under this repatriation law that we have. And so one of the things that I've been working on quite a bit over the last several years have been revisions to the regulations that govern NAGPRA. So for those of you who are familiar with the federal regulations and rulemaking process, Congress passes a law, and then the executive branch passes regulations that implement those laws and give further guidance and rules how to carry out that law. The regulations for NAGPRA were first implemented in 1995. They've been added to over time, and this part of our website actually has all of the final rules that have been issued for NAGPRA and additions to the NAGPRA regulations. But in October of 2022, so just a little over a year ago, the Department of the Interior issued revised regulations that rewrote the entire NAGPRA regulations. The effort here was to update the regulations to simplify them, clarify them, make it easier to understand the process for repatriation. And what you're seeing here on the screen are a lot of the materials that we provided to assist people with understanding the changes that we were proposing to these regulations, as well as the proposed regulations themselves, which admittedly were quite long. So we published those proposed rules in October of last year. They were available for public comment through January of this year. And we are hopeful that a final rule will be published within the next month to 6 weeks. So before the end of the year, our hope is that the final rule will publish. And regulations do have the force of law in the United States. After they go through this process of a proposed rule and public comment and final rule, they are then a part of the legal framework and are enforceable and must be followed. So these are important changes for museums in particular to pay attention to and to understand the changes in the regulations and the changes in the requirements. And in particular, some of the changes to the timelines in the proposed, in the final regulations when they are published. One of the main reasons for the changes in the regulations are the large numbers of Native American human remains that are still in museum collections after 33 years of the law. What you're seeing on the screen is a data visualization that my office publishes every year. I'll share the link in the chat. We publish this data as a part of our annual reporting, and you can play around with it. It's a visualization, so you can dig into the data a little bit. But what this first page shows you is the overall data that under NAGPRA, about over 213,000 Native American ancestors have been reported in museum and federal agency collections. That's 213,000 people have been reported in museum collections across the country. And only about 55%, when you add up all the numbers, have been through the regulatory process and have been made available to tribes for repatriation. There's still about 45% that are still in museum collections and have not completed this regulatory process. They're still waiting for consultation and notification. And so part of the changes in the regulations are to go through that process, to require that consultation and notification process to occur for all of the human remains that are in museum and federal agency collections. So that's a kind of an overview of sort of one of the main reasons for some of the changes in the timeline of the regulations. Let me just move my screen a little bit here. I don't often get to focus on the Alaska portion of my maps, so it was fun to zoom in for you. This same page, you can, again, play around with it a little bit, and we have different tabs here for looking at the data in different ways. And one way to look at it is to look at where the human remains were removed from, so where they were excavated from. And this shows you that about just over 2,000 ancestors were removed from the state of Alaska. And a very large percentage, about 82%, almost 83%, of those have completed the regulatory process and have been returned to Alaska Natives. There's still a small percentage there of remains that were taken from Alaska that are still in museum collections. Now, this is showing you those that were, again, removed from Alaska. It doesn't say they're necessarily still in Alaska. As I'm sure all of you are probably aware, or maybe most of you are aware, Alaska is one of those states where many of the collections that were removed from the state of Alaska ended up being taken to other states across the country. That is not the case in most states in the United States. Most collections stayed within the state in which they were collected. But Alaska, along with New Mexico, maybe a few other places are those locations where collections were more likely to be taken out of the state once they were excavated. Although I will say that, if you look, let me see if I can do this easily. I can remove my filters. Yes. The number of ancestors that were removed from Alaska is relatively small compared to some of the other states. You can see just here, obviously California is quite large number of ancestors were removed from California and Arizona, as well as Alabama. but also a large number have already been returned to Alaska. And I think that those are positive signs of NAGPRA having worked well in Alaska, in many cases, at least better than it has in some of the other states in the United States. And then the last page I wanted to share with you here, sorry, I'm having trouble getting my Zoom out of the way so I can see my tabs. Here we go. The last one I wanted to share with you is to show you those Native American ancestors that are still in holdings or collections, so still pending consultation and notification, and that are located in the state of Alaska. So the majority of those are at the University of Alaska, at the Museum of the North. And the numbers aren't terribly large, although again, I know that many people would say that one ancestor in a holding or collection is too many. But there's about 191 ancestors that are still in a collection at the University of Alaska Museum of the North. And that looks like to be the majority of them that are located within the state of Alaska that are still waiting to go through the repatriation process under the regulations. So that's a little bit of location relevant information for you. How about I'll stop there for a minute and see if there are some questions before I go on. I have another document to share with you about the new regulations, but I'll just pause right there in case anybody has questions.
Look like it, but feel free to. Oh, we got Angie. Hi, Angie.
Hey, yeah, I just wanted to, if anybody is concerned about that number at the UA Museum of the North, I just want to assure you all, our institution received a National NAGPRA grant for consultation, and just in about March, we're undertaking kind of a new and hopefully model kind of project for communities and states to deal with those ancestors who have no cultural affiliation that is able to be attributed. And so this is, I think, for most museums, this is the stopping problem that people don't know how to deal with it. And so what we're doing is we're having virtual and in-person consultations with tribes. We've invited every single federally recognized tribe in the state to attend one or both of those sessions. And we are putting it to the communities to tell us what they would like to see happen with these. And so we're hoping that through both this virtual and in-person consultation with everyone, that we can be told what Alaska Native people would like to see happen with these ancestors, so that we're not the ones making those decisions. That's for the community to decide. And so hopefully that will, and I think Josh told me that that's 180 individuals that are part of that that group. So that should take care of, hopefully, this, if anybody was concerned about seeing that number by one of your colleagues here in the state. So thanks for giving me the opportunity to share that information.
Of course. Thank you, Angie, for the update. That's a really helpful update, and I'm excited to see what happens. It does sound like it'll be a real model, and hopefully it will help other museums. Awesome. Anyone else? Okay.
All right, a quiet group, I guess. All right, I will share with you a document that we have been working on here to help explain the new regulations. Hopefully you can see this. This is something that I shared just last week at the annual repatriation conference that's hosted by the Association on American Indian Affairs, and was a part of the training session that I provided as a part of that conference. And this is something that we intend on sharing as a part of the rollout for the new regulations. And the whole idea behind the revisions to the regulations was to create a sort of step-by-step process to make it easier to understand what comes next in the process for repatriation. And so, again, this is not necessarily new. It's just that we've tried to simplify and clarify the process. This is really even more simplified and put in colorful blocks to make regulations even easier to understand. Again, this is just a summary of what is in the regulations themselves. And it lays out the basic steps of the NAGPRA process. And in this case, it's the process for human remains and associated funerary objects. It's important to remember that the NAGPRA regulations and the law itself are really written and directed towards museums and federal agencies. They are the ones that have the burden here and the responsibilities of taking certain actions. And then there are options and actions that Indian tribes and Alaska Natives can take throughout this process, but those are options, not requirements. But the actor here, or the subject of these regulations and of the actor, the museums and federal agencies. So as you read these steps, you can think of the museum as the one who must do these things in the steps. And so the first step in NAGPRA for human remains and associated funerary objects is to basically compile a list, to make a list of those human remains and associated funerary objects in a collection with the information that is available. The second step is to begin consultation. Consultation is, if you're not familiar with NAGPRA, is a very critical and central piece of NAGPRA. So it is the second piece of the puzzle after you figure out what you have, is to start consulting on what you have. And then the third step here is the consultation itself. And once consultation is complete, once you get input from Indian tribes or Alaska Natives or Native Hawaiian organizations, then you are able to then complete your inventory. And in that inventory of human remains and associated funerary objects, you make certain decisions about those human remains, including whether there is an affiliation. And I'll share this document in the chat, and then Dixie will also make it available. The second page provides the deadlines, and you can see we've still got some highlights here because until the regulations are final, these dates are not set. But the deadlines for completing inventories are a part of what the regulations will change. For those of you who aren't very familiar with NAGPRA, the law itself stated that this process, these steps 1 through 4, would be finished by 1995. Well, it is a little past 1995 at this point, and there are still some museums and federal agencies that have not completed their inventories. So part of the effort here with the regulations is to ensure that we are we are resetting this time frame and ensuring that all of the human remains and associated funerary objects have been identified, have been consulted on within a set time frame. Now, I will mention that the law, the current regulations, and the changed regulations provide for extensions. If museums are unable to meet these deadlines, they can request an extension for additional time to meet that deadline. And then these are the last steps of the process, again, to complete the repatriation process. Again, not really new, but trying to explain in a clearer, more direct way how to get from that inventory to the repatriation itself. There are a few pieces here that aren't as clear in the existing regulations. Right now, it's kind of unclear how a museum must respond to a request for repatriation. So that's where step 7 has tried to clarify how what a museum must do when it receives a request for repatriation of human remains and associated funerary objects. And the new regulations will give specific responses that a museum must provide to that request for repatriation. And again, for those of you who maybe aren't familiar with NAGPRA, or maybe those of you who are very familiar with it, you know, we often get asked how many objects have been repatriated or how many human remains have been repatriated. Well, it's not really information that we have because there's no requirement beyond a notice for a museum or federal agency to really report on. So the new regulations will require an additional written document, and that is a repatriation statement that comes at the end of the process to really to finalize that process of the repatriation. In preparing this document, we provided some timelines, some possible timelines for how the process could work. Both of these timelines are hypothetical, and both of them make a pretty big assumption, really a wrong assumption, I'll say outright. And that is that consultation, as well as requests for repatriation, both of which are discretionary acts by Indian tribes or Alaska Natives or Native Hawaiian organizations, would occur in one day. We know that's not true. We know that those acts will take longer, but for the sake of parity between the timelines and not knowing the length of those requests, we just assumed one day. But you can see why there's such a great variance here in how museums might carry out these steps, because it could take anywhere from 40 days to almost 3 years to follow these 8 steps, depending on the length of time that a museum might take for each of these steps. Regardless of the length of time that a tribe or Alaska Native or a Native Hawaiian organization might need for consultation or making its requests. The museum itself has a lot of discretion in how much time it allocates for these different tasks. And then the last half of this document looks at the other side of repatriation, the part that we haven't really talked about today, which is the repatriation of other kinds of cultural items. So those things that are not human remains or associated funerary objects. So unassociated funerary objects, objects of cultural patrimony, or sacred objects. The regulations, again, apply this step-by-step process to the requirements for those kinds of cultural items. The process is very similar, although in some ways the order might be a little bit different because the process and the obligations are slightly different when it comes to the cultural items. But again, you can see that consultation is right up front in steps 2 and 3. Again, the new regulations try to provide more guidance to museums and federal agencies on how to respond to requests for repatriation. Again, include that final step of a written repatriation statement. And again, I'll share this document. I know I'm going through it quite quickly. We've done the same thing here with a timeline, possible timeline, making that same assumption, showing the great variation in how long it might take to complete a repatriation of cultural items, depending on that discretion of a museum or federal agency. So I will stop there. Again, this is just one of the many tools that we are working on in preparing for the new regulations to try to assist museums and federal agencies, as well as Indian tribes and Alaska Natives and Native Hawaiians with information that they can use in working with these new regulations. So I'm happy to take any questions.
That was helpful. Martin?
Yeah, can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Yeah, I'm not a museum professional, but I know Angie and Josh, so that's good enough. I want to talk about the first step, that is identifying human remains and funeral objects. You know, in the West, of course, there are a lot of museums that have freak shows, and they might have a jawbone or something else that was dug up by a farmer's plow, and it doesn't really have any good provenance. But what do you ask them first? To all your human remains, either unidentified or identified, with provenance? And then you go from there and you count down and try to discount the ones that aren't native oriented. And then you, of course, you probably keep the jawbone or something, but I'm just curious. I mean, I just see a list saying, give me all your human remains, regardless of whether you can identify them as native or not, and then you go from there. So is that kind of the idea? Over.
Yeah, thanks, Martin, for your question. I think I kind of left that part out of my simplified slide there for you. The first step is to decide whether or not they're Native American. That is a necessary piece of the process, because until you make that decision, you don't know whether this law and these regulations apply. These steps only apply to Native American human remains. Now, how do you make that decision? Especially if, as you say, there's just random human remains with very little or next to no information. A lot of times you have to go based on what you do know about how it was collected or where it was, who had it, who owned it, who collected it, who acquired it, or where. Sometimes you can get advice from people with professional expertise who can make identifications based on certain physical characteristics. And quite often, our advice in those circumstances is to at least consult so that you can try to work with tribal experts to see if you can make an identification. If you can't, or if there's a clear identification that it's not Native American, then there's no need to go any further with the NAGPRA process. but that is the first decision point here.
You know, that's of course the biggest part when you ask for just, the part that might be funeral objects, or in the case of a jawbone or something, you really don't know. And I can imagine the shotgun approach would probably put a lot of museum directors and curators saying, oh my God, that's a lot of research. And then I had sort of one unrelated question. At the very beginning, you had a slide with boomerangs, and I'm not certain if boomerangs, are Native American, but I'm sure there are some. And other than Australia, I don't think you can extend your regulations to Australia. So maybe just tell me where the boomerangs came from, just for curiosity. Over.
Sure, I'll share that screen again. They're not boomerangs. I'm not sure I could tell you exactly what they are. I think you're referring to this photo here.
Correct. Yes.
They look like boomerangs, I agree, but they are in fact something else, and I'm not going to speculate on what, but they are in fact some other Native American object.
Okay, well, I don't see any Hawaiians in there, so I guess you were safe. So that's it for me.
Okay.
Can I ask a question? Can you hear me?
Yes. Yes.
Thanks. I just had a question, just being as I had sat in on a meeting, and I hope to ask this in the most respectful light about human remains, because I hadn't really thought about that in my internship. And it does seem like, in the instance of the ones that I have seen or heard discussions about, that there's a lot of parties involved, and some of them I'm trying to figure out the necessity of why those parties are involved, because from kind of the acquisition notes, it feels like they were taken from Tongass National Forest, which must make them part of that federal agency, and then the tribal government, and then the institution holding the remains. Is it always necessary to include all those parties when returning the remains? Or does that question make sense? It feels like there's a lot of people involved to get the mechanism to move forward. When I don't know why the museum and the tribe aren't just working together. It seems like they also have to include, and maybe Addison could correct me on this, but there seems like there's another party involved, and waiting for them to all communicate in a timely manner seems to be kind of the delay in holding these remains from being returned.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense to me. While this is not a uniquely Alaska problem, it is a widely Alaska problem. And it has largely to do with the amount of federal land that you have or used to have in Alaska. What you're talking about is, for lack of a better term, I'm just going to use the term ownership for clarity. You're talking about ownership of the land from which the human remains were removed, and that ultimately then means who has responsibility for the repatriation. In reality, the parties that need to be at the table are the landowner and the tribe. In effect, it is the museum that may be holding the remains now that doesn't necessarily need to be at the table. However, that's not often the case, especially when a museum may have held those human remains for 100 years or maybe even longer. May have been the one to excavate the remains, may also be the one that has all the records related to the human remains. So necessarily then all of the parties need to come together to share information. I will say that where we see this work really well is where the museum and the federal agency agree that they're going to defer to the tribe or the Alaska Natives, and do whatever it is that the Alaska Native wants to do in terms of facilitating repatriation. We can often see the delay and the conflicts between the museum and the federal agency delaying the repatriation. And it is, in my point of view, needless. There is no reason to sort out any kind of issue between the museum and the federal agency over ownership or control of parts of a collection, some of a collection, who excavated what, when, or where. In my opinion, there's very little need to go into that if the purpose is repatriation. And so our advice is always to try to get the museum and the federal agency to work together and to defer to the wishes of the Alaska Native in this case, to move forward to the repatriation. I hope that answers your question.
Is there just a generalized document that the tribe or one of the agencies could send to the Fed? We'll say feds in this sense because that's who we're referring to say, why don't you just sign these documents to defer this so we can work directly with the museum to I don't want, maybe expedite isn't even in the right term. I want to be culturally sensitive to that, but to alleviate the need for the crosstalk. It seems excessive.
Yeah, well, so expedite is the right word. Expedite is the word that Congress used. So I would say that's the correct word here. Yeah, so a federal agency could delegate its authority to anybody it wants. That is perfectly acceptable. And the federal agency could tell the museum to proceed on its behalf. That is a possibility. We don't often see federal agencies doing that, and there may be other reasons for that that I'm not aware of. So I don't want to say that the federal agency can do that, because maybe they have other reasons they can't or wouldn't do that. From my perspective, that's a possibility. I wish I had a good answer for you in how to cut through the red tape that can often be the federal agency problem here.
As a tribal citizen, I can say the tribal red tape's probably a lot too, just to lighten the mood. But
yeah.
I guess my final question on that then is the idea that if they were returned, can they be returned on federal lands where they were taken from?
You mean, could they be reburied?
Correct.
In most cases, yes. It depends on what federal agency you're talking about and the federal land management issues, right? So a federal land manager wouldn't want to rebury something where it might be endangered again. So there are other issues involved in a reburial than just whether it's allowed or not. But in most cases, federal agencies can allow for it. There are other questions about protection. I will say that generally the Forest Service has the broadest authority for reburial. The Park Service has a pretty broad authority for things that were removed from Park Service property. BLM has a pretty broad authority as well. So in general, again, there's pretty broad authorities for reburial, but it comes down to the land management needs.
Okay. Well, thank you for the question. It's just more fascinating to me, and just wanted to know a little bit more about this. I appreciate that. Thank you.
Sure.
Angie?
Thanks. Yeah, thanks for sharing these really nice graphics for the steps and the suggested timelines. I wanted to talk really quickly about the other cultural items. One of the things that we've found over the years of doing reporting and having a number of consultation grants that have allowed us to redo our inventories and summaries and send out all new lists to tribes across the state. one of the things that we found is that we are not going to be the ones to designate what's a sacred object and what is an object of cultural patrimony. And so we took the approach a long time ago that rather than creating a summary, trying to identify what a summary might be, that we just send lists to every community of every single cultural item that we have. And then as part of that consultation process, then when we send those lists out, we let people know, in that letter that we are inviting them to consult with us and to provide us information about what they might consider a sacred object or an object of cultural patrimony, and that we can proceed from, for direct consultation after that. So if people are concerned about how do I decide what is a sacred object, what is an object of cultural patrimony, don't even worry about it. That's our recommendation. Just make your lists. If you've got geographic locations, and we have, for the bulk of the materials in our collections, we have assumed geographic location of where that item is collected is also cultural affiliation of the people who live there in modern times. And so reporting those to the federally recognized tribes. And we've had, really good success in that dialogue then that results as following that process. So just a little bit of experience from our end of doing this multiple times if people are still kind of tripping up over that process.
Thanks for sharing.
Yeah, I think that's really great. And I would highly encourage this group to see if it couldn't share some examples or best practices around what a good summary for Alaska looks like. Because I think it's those regional examples that can really be useful and helpful in those kinds of cases.
Oh, yeah, we'll look into doing that. That sounds great. Thank you. Teal?
Hi. Yeah, so I also wanted to basically ask another question, or ask a question about the non-funerary objects or the human remains, so the sacred objects and objects of cultural patrimony. How do you officially determine what is considered as sacred? And I'm going to read something just to kind of give an example. But just as an example, take the decorated spruce root hats, which is a garment that reflects wealth and elite status in cultural Sokriak society. To some, this is a religious artifact, as it was likely worn at ceremonial occasions. To others, however, it is a beautiful but functional item, as woven hats were also worn for daily activities. Still, others might suggest that, regardless of its original use, changes in cultural practices over 2 centuries have rendered the hat most valuable as an educational tool. In other words, its function is now secular. Another group might argue that the hat is sacred because it is a gift from the past. It represents an irreplaceable piece of history whose spiritual power lies in the present and its ability to uplift and inspire. So how are we able to designate items as being, how do we determine if they are considered sacred if the museum that we are talking to does not consider it to be a sacred object that should be returned? Another example is whaling gear. And there's a bunch of items that might be in connection to this, but there is a lot of ceremony around going whaling, and in that preparation, model canoes and things like this, and including the gear itself, which are often covered in poison. So how are we supposed to fight? But that can just be seen as a tool that may not want to be, I don't know, just anyways. Yeah. And how would you suggest that we go about this if there is a museum that's fighting us on what our people consider as sacred?
That is a really good question, Teal. And I wish that I had a really good answer for your really good question. And forgive me for taking a minute. I did this a lot last week, and I realized that maybe I take longer pauses than most people to.
It's okay. I know that's you also you don't want to just speak and then yeah, you can't take that back, and sometimes it's gonna be touchy for many people in the field. So if anybody else also has anything that they would like to share in response to my question or their experiences, I'd be
so let me give you let me tell you what we're trying to do with the changes in the regulations to address this issue. The first is that in all the definitions for any cultural item, sacred object, object of cultural patrimony, or funerary object, we have included in the definition, beyond just clarifying what the definition in the statute itself is, so what the law says, we have also added that the definition must include information from tribes or Alaska Natives. So we've added a clause that says, at least in the proposed rule, said, according to Native American traditional knowledge of lineal descendants, Indian tribes, or NHOs. And in this case, Alaska Natives are Indian tribes. Just want to be very clear that that's in the regulatory and legal language included. So our first hope is that museum, once these regulations are final, will do a better job of listening to tribes in when they provide their definitions for these objects, because that is in fact what Congress intended. There's very clear legislative history. When Congress developed these definitions, they intended them to be broad because they recognized that every tribe and village would have its own definition for what these kinds of objects would be. And we have the direct quote from the legislative history in our very long documents. But it is almost exactly that. Congress said they realized with over the number of tribes and villages, these definitions are going to differ, and the tribes and villages need to be the ones to provide these definitions. So, the goal of the revisions is to get back to what Congress intended, so that the kinds of disagreements or arguments you're talking about don't happen. Now, I say that to you knowing that may not be the reality that occurs. The other thing that we've tried to do with the revisions to the regulations, and again in the long documents, is to provide better explanations for how you might meet the definition of an object. And so what you just provided were multiple views of how an object might be described. Part of the issue becomes when a museum says, well, this object could be described as utilitarian or important, so therefore it can't be important if it also could be described as utilitarian. The issue then becomes one of a museum somehow making a balance or a judgment, when what the law requires is that the tribe make a request and the museum evaluate the request. So what we've tried to do with the step-by-step process is provide that opportunity for the tribe to put forward its request, and in that request state why the object meets the definition, so that the museum doesn't have as much room to look for other arguments, if that makes sense. Where if a tribe asserts that an object meets a definition, then the museum has to say whether it meets the criteria or it does not, and they have to explain why, and then provide the tribe with additional opportunity to present additional information. So I think, I guess I don't know if I'm helping or if I'm just babbling at this point, but I hope that under the revised regulations, there's more opportunity to at least get a clearer request and a response from a museum, so there's less of an ambiguous back and forth between tribes and museums.
Kim? Oh, wait, so sorry, Teal, did you have a follow-up question, Teal?
No, I think she answered it as best as possible. Thank you.
I'm sorry that you're having issues with museums and
Oh no, it's just honestly in preparation, because there's another problem that I have is that, there's a lot of museums that I truly look up to who have been open and welcome to collaborating, or just those who I really look up to, and I don't want to go to war with people, or
Yeah.
close down any communications or any sort of collaboration in the future, because even if we do some sort of repatriation, I don't want, that doesn't mean that we're going to get all of our items back. It still means that there's going to be items that are left there realistically, and I don't want any sort of collaboration in the future, or people to be hindered because of anything that we end up having to fight them for. Yeah.
yeah, it's understandable. Okay, so
Hi,
Yep.
this is Kim Arthur, and I can't show my video. I'm limited Wi-Fi.
Okay,
So I just want to address Teal's comment. And from my memory and knowledge, I took a NAGPRA class with the University of Arizona Indigenous Peoples Law program way back. And one of the things is that, is that unfortunately it is on the different tribes to produce enough of line of evidence as to what is considered sacred versus cultural patrimony versus a funerary object. And if that information is not recorded when said materials were stolen. And that does put a lot of emotional, work on the people who are trying to make those designations. I'm from the Southwest, and there are, conflicts in terms of different tribes. If you're within an area, they can both, in a way, prove cultural affiliation, lineage. So there are things that do come up like that. That's very real in terms of just with how people moved and formalize their federal recognition. It does happen, and unfortunately, it is up to the tribe to determine a lot of the line of evidence of what that object is and how they would like to receive it back, or if they don't receive it back, like it does happen. Just wanted to say that.
What would you, I mean, first of all, so you said it had to be recorded as being sacred or ceremonial at the time that it was stolen. Is that what you said?
Sometimes, like, usually it's easier if that is the case, if there's enough information on those materials. If there's not, it's up to the tribe to prove what is considered sacred, what is cultural patrimony, which is, funerary object and or stuff like that. Because I know sometimes some tribes, some members will say like, no, that's not a sacred object. It's just this type of object. It really varies. It really goes back to the tribe's burden of proof and what it is they are determining falls under NAGPRA sometimes. So it's kind of like, the law only says so much what the tribes can do versus what the tribes are saying, like, no, this is what it is. And, a lot of materials were misidentified to hide that they were stolen, or to hide that, oh yeah, this is not really a significant object when it really is. So it's just a lot of back and forth, unfortunately, and research.
That's also such a kind of like a westernized system going about this, because this information is passed down through oral tradition primarily, and only at a certain point in time was it starting to be recorded, and it's being recorded by non-Indigenous people. So it's
Yeah.
also their interpretation of what the native person is saying, which is also likely their second language. So that's just really weird also to just assume that, not assume, but to hope that these people who were stealing, trading, buying these items from the people are also making records of what they mean culturally and how accurate that is. So that's
Yeah.
like, I feel like there's still a lot of improvement left that needs to happen here.
I have a follow-up question for Melanie on the legal side. In the law, does it say that the tribes are the ones who have to come up with proof, or is that something museums have kind of put on tribes?
Well, the answer is yes and no. So the law definitely says that tribes have to make requests and that tribes have to provide information through consultation about the identity of objects. Now, I think that, sorry, I forgot, Kim, was it?
Mhm.
Yeah, I think what Kim is alluding to is the practice that has evolved over 30 years is museums saying, well, that's not enough information. You need to prove it. You need to prove to us that this was sacred. You need to prove, we need more information. We need more information about how you used the object. We need more information to be sure that it was used in a ceremony. You need to explain the ceremony to us. Well, Congress didn't say that. So I think that there has been, the practice over 30 years has kind of changed a little bit of what we think is the requirement under NAGPRA. And that's where we're hopeful that some of the revisions to the regulations, and in particular, saying no more than that tribes provide Native American traditional knowledge without saying anything more, right? You don't need to explain the ceremony. You just need to say that there is a ceremony, if that's appropriate even. Maybe not even saying that. Saying because of Native American traditional knowledge, this is a sacred item, is sufficient to meet the legal standard.
Okay. Yeah, I was thinking it might be something museums had kind of put on tribes to say, we don't want to give this up. We're going to force you to jump through more hoops, which is ridiculous. So yeah, I'm glad that it's not in the actual law. Teal, you have
Okay, sorry. It was just a follow-up. So you're saying that you no longer have to provide proof or evidence of it being sacred?
You never did.
Okay. So that's what I was like wondering, if they're going to continue to try to be like, well, no, you have to tell us all the stuff. So if they're going to say that, if they're going to ask that of us now, we're not necessarily going to have to do so. We can say, no, you're trying to get us to do all these things that aren't necessary to this process.
Yeah, I mean, I think that unfortunately, Teal, it puts you in the same position, which is that you might risk them telling you no, then we're not going to repatriate it. You might end up being in conflict with the museum that still has objects that you want repatriated, or objects that you don't want repatriated. It is a difficult position that you can be put in, which is unfair and is not what Congress intended. The goal of the law was for tribes to be able to assert their rights to their objects and to be able to bring them home based on that assertion. We're hopeful that the regulations get us closer to that with the revisions. I remain hopeful that some new dawn will be with, these clearer words, and museums will, open their eyes and say, okay, sure, here. But I also am maybe not that completely unrealistic. So, but I do think there has been change. We have seen change. We have seen, we've seen movement in museum policy. We have seen museums agree to repatriations that they did not previously agree to. So I do think that there is positive change.
And if they do say no, then you're gonna have to provide proof anyways. You're gonna have to tell them why. They can't just say no anyways, which is also a bummer because sometimes those ceremonies and that knowledge is private and you don't want it to be documented on such a level, but
Well, the other benefit here is if they do say no, they're gonna have to do it in writing. And once they say no to you in writing, you have something that's more actionable. If the tribe chooses to take some action after that. If the museum tells you no, then you have options. More than you have right now.
Yeah, and that's what that writing, the new regulation to have them put in writing what the decision is. That'll help.
Yeah.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, I will say, Teal, it's definitely sometimes you have to wait people out at the museum, which is very unfortunate. Sometimes you just have to wait for them to retire or go to a different museum to get a different answer. It often has to deal with the people in the museum, which is extremely unfortunate. But like Melanie said, just since I've been in the museum field the last 10 plus years, there has been a shift. And I do see that continuing to shift, and I'm hopeful for the future of museums. And I just wish it was a little faster. I think a lot of people in the museum world feel that way.
thank you.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Addison, I saw your hand up at some point. Did you have a question?
Hi, Dixie. I did, but I looked at the regulation. Excuse me. I looked at the regulation and answered my own question. So.
Oh, okay.
That's my favorite question.
Is there another question? Let me see. Ashley.
Yeah, could you talk more about the grants that would be available for smaller, predominantly volunteer museums to help them get their true resources to be able to do these projects when they don't have the paid staff to do it?
Yeah, sure. We've had a lot of successful grants in Alaska, and we've had a lot of successful grants for museums of all sizes. We have two kinds of grants. The first kind is the bigger grants, which are for consultation projects, where you would work with your collection, but then to consult with tribes on your collection with a goal of repatriation. All of our grants are with a goal of repatriation. So we don't provide grants for curation for curation's sake, but for repatriation purposes. So where a small museum had a collection that it wanted to get a better sense of geographic origin of the collection. If we're talking about collection of non-human remains, for example, maybe to identify the geographic location of collection and identify potential cultural affiliation for repatriation. And then consultation, that would be a great project. Our grant cycle is generally, we make our notice of funding opportunity available through grants.gov, usually about this time. I think somebody was sick this week, so I'm not sure it's going to be tomorrow or Friday, but it's usually right before Thanksgiving that we make the notice of funding opportunity available. And then the grants are due in early March. And then the other grant opportunity we have is repatriation grants, and those just fund the last part. So the physical transfer of an object after a notice is published from a museum to a tribe. And those applications can come from either a museum or a tribe. Consultation grants can come from a museum or a tribe, either one. And they can fund just about any part of the activity. They can fund staff time at the museum. They can fund travel for the tribe to come to the museum. We've seen a lot of successful grants where the museum travels to the tribe. Depending on your collection and the geography of your state, those are all options. We have funded grant funds could support a Zoom license if that might be something that would assist a small institution in communicating with tribes. Trying to think of other things that might support consultation, but pretty much it's pretty broad what a consultation grant can fund. Obviously, because the purpose is repatriation, ultimately we don't fund permanent storage. Like I said, we don't fund curation, right? So we generally don't fund archival storage or those kinds of things that are more permanent in nature. But other ways of maybe pretty much anything else we fund, as long as it is related to NAGPRA items or potential NAGPRA items. Does that help?
Yes.
Okay, awesome. Is there any other questions? Okay, so if someone wants to learn more, I'm trying to think, you have all the resources on your website. There's the repatriation conference every year.
Oh yeah, a big resource, I can't believe I didn't tell you about, is the NAGPRA Community of Practice. So the NAGPRA Community of Practice, I'll find the link and share it. Is for anybody who's interested, museum, tribe, whoever, and is a great resource, has bi-monthly meetings on the second and fourth Friday of every month, although none in November and only one in December because holidays and other things. Great resources. There's a whole resource Google Drive resource place, whatever we call those things now. Also recorded videos of all the sessions that they've had available. Great listserv. You can ask questions directly of other people involved in NAGPRA, or you can send anonymous questions directly to the moderator, Anna Motti, and she'll post an anonymous question to the listserv. Great resource for anybody involved in NAGPRA to connect with other people. And something for you all to think about, we've seen a great growth in regional NAGPRA community of practices. So there's a Southeast group, a Northeast group, a Southwest group, a California group, and perhaps maybe there might want to be some interest in an Alaska NAGPRA community practice someday, where people engaged in NAGPRA in Alaska can just get together and talk between themselves and make connections. The community of practice grew out of an IMLS museum leadership grant. It is now out of its grant phase, but still just surviving and thriving. No budget, all volunteers, but still an active, very vibrant group of people who come together and just very much like this group, share interest and experience and support each other.
Awesome. Thanks for sharing that.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, I'm wondering if that's something that we should look into as Museums Alaska, a NAGPRA community practice group, and or maybe someone else should be hosting that. But it's something that I think is definitely of interest. There are so many tribes here in Alaska. So, and a lot of, as you said, a lot of human remains and cultural belongings are elsewhere. So bringing them back home is a big deal. Okay, if that's everything, I think we'll go ahead and let people go a few minutes early. It's always nice. Get some minutes back into your day. Thank you all for joining us. I really appreciate it. Let me know if you have any questions, if you think of anything. And thank you so much, Melanie. This was extremely helpful. I learned a lot. I'm not a collections person myself, so it was great to have this overview and update and learn what's new and what's changing. So that was really helpful.
Yeah. If anybody has questions, you feel free to reach out to us directly. We have contact information on our website. We have a general inbox, but it comes directly to me. So don't hesitate to use that inbox and reach out, and either I or one of our 5 other staff members will get back to you. So
5 people for the entire country. Well,
yeah.
you just do great work.
Well, it was great to be with you, and I am glad though I don't have to deal with your snow. So
Oh, yes.
stay safe.
Yep. Thank you. Thanks, everyone. Bye.